Bible says God loveth a cheerful giver. Amen. So we ought to be good, loose, and free as we come and bless the Lord at this time.
Antioch listeners, right now I feel like I'm a pastor at that part of the service when it's time for offering. And you know the budget's down and you don't want to try to manipulate people into giving more because they already give a lot, but you also want to let people know the situation because if things don't improve, the church is going to shut down. You need to talk about asking people to do more than just come and listen. Now, we at the Antioch podcast aren't going to shut down. We are in this, but we are asking you to do more than just come and listen. I mean, here's the thing. We're having difficulty reaching people, and the only way we can do better with this is with your individual help. We don't need money. I mean, if you want to send us money to advertise, we'd love it, but that's not what we're asking. What we need is this. We need you to share links to the Antioch podcast and leave us a review. That's it. It seems simple, right? But if you're like me, you listen when you're busy driving, working out, running the kids around, or just running around like a crazy person. I mean, I get it. You're busy. Duly noted. Me too, believe me. But the fact remains that without shares and reviews on Apple Podcasts, people can't find us. It's just how search engines work. So, what can we do over here to help you remember to do these two little things? These two little things that can help us reach people with the good news of what the Bible says about anti-racism. Let's face it, the American church has a problem with how to deal with racism across racial groups. So the need is there to get this message out. So we had an idea. We want to say thank you for helping us. We just need you to do those two things and let us know that you did. So here's how. Share an episode of the podcast or a link to the podcast webpage on your favorite social media. Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you use, share an episode. Tag people if you like, but then take a screenshot of your share. Then go over to the Apple Podcast page and leave us a review. Then take a screenshot of your review because we don't know your real name isn't actually Zippy Ninja or Little Dragon Lover or Cheese Master or John Q Public 123. We know you have a different name, so you got to let us know. Then send both screenshots over to us in an email along with your mailing address to antiochpod@gmail.com. That's antiochpod@gmail.com. In return, we'll send you an Antioch Podcast die-cut sticker. I know it isn't much, but we wanted to say thank you somehow because you mean a lot to us. It's why we do what we do at the Antioch Podcast. We do it for you. Help us find more people just like you who want to grow in their faith as faithful anti-racists who love Jesus and justice. Thanks.
You're listening to the Antioch Podcast.
Conversations about biblical anti-racism.
Have mercy.
Let me say it one more time.
The Antioch Podcast.
A podcast ministry of Madison Church.
Oh, I got Jesus, yeah.
Hello, welcome to the Antioch Podcast, conversations about biblical anti-racism. My name is Eric Nykamp. Today is the first episode in what will be a chapter-by-chapter book study by the Antioch team of Jemar Tisby's must-read history of the American Church, The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American Church's complicity in racism. Every episode, the multiracial Antioch team gathers around a table, turns on the mics, and talks about the topics in each chapter. All the members of the Antioch team are devout Christians and committed anti-racists, approaching faith and justice from each of our unique perspectives, shaped by our intersectional identities, personal histories, and professional backgrounds in education. We believe that the New Testament Church, starting at the church in Antioch, learned to have these kinds of conversations as Christianity transformed from a monoethnic community to a multiethnic one. These recorded conversations are examples of the kinds of dialogue we hope happen more and more often in today's multiethnic world. The kinds of conversations which must be at the foundation of our relationships so we can, in time, truly worship diversely together. Let's go now and hear today's conversation. For those of you that are listening right now, we kind of game plan each episode a little bit beforehand, and today we were talking about what is chapter 1 of The Color of Compromise all about. So, what would you say in a sentence is what stuck out to you?
We've missed a lot of opportunities throughout history to stand up, and what does that mean for us today? Are we missing opportunities today?
I was intrigued by the idea that the church in America is distinctly formed by its history of racism. It's not just a few acts, but it's a part of our foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What stood out to you?
Yeah, that kind of stood out to me is these contradictions in history, these contradictions of how black people live their lives in the American experience, and the contradiction of how white people live their lives in America. But even more specifically of how the white church lived its life in this American experience, and how black people who became Christian on this land acted in their terms of their own lives, and how those don't seem to come together very often, from 1776 to 2019. And why is that? Why? And I appreciate Tisby's willingness to kind of give us kind of this historical survey of the church and how it practiced its Christianity in very contradictory ways. Mm-hmm. And now some of that kind of came into focus, after the 2016 presidential election.
Does it concern you that many people saw that tweet as racist, and that white nationalist groups are finding common cause with you on that point?
It doesn't concern me because many people agree with me, and all I'm saying, they want to leave.
I'm going to just say, I think the election and the presidency of Barack Obama brought out a lot about how many whites, but I want to say many white Christians, about how they really felt about the whole idea of having an African American president, and I think it brought out this sense of there's something not quite right about that. There's something not quite white Christian about that, and I think it's symbolized, especially in terms of the reaction that has happened not only in the United States, but also in terms of the white evangelical church, that the church saw itself as what we are losing as opposed to what they were gaining, that more people were willing to believe that Barack Obama was a Muslim when he was really a Christian. And so you bring up these kind of contrasts of, well, what's really wrong about that? And I think Tisby is kind of laying out how we wonderfully and naturally and subtly become complicit in our own racism, because we like to think that, no, I'm not one of those guys that got a hood on, or I'm not one of those guys who's carrying a tiki torch down in Charlottesville, but rather how we choose to be complicit is that by our inaction, right, to think that that is a normal way in which we give resistance to the whole idea of the narrative, white is right in the United States.
Before Obama was elected, there were handmade signs that were posted up around my house, within a mile, out in the outskirts of Grand Rapids, saying, "Vote right, vote white."
What?
Oh, yeah.
You have a charming neighborhood, Susie. I just got to say,
when can I move into your neighborhood?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I guess I want to throw this out here, too, not to detract from the book at all, but the lens that Jemar Tisby has is that he is specifically looking at black-white relations, even though we could take and pull on this thread through any number of people groups. Those are the two groups that he's focusing on for two reasons. One is that he's African American and he heads up The Witness, which is a black Christian collective. I mean, this is his home base. He knows what he's talking about. The guy's also he's getting his PhD in history. So if you've ever heard him, he's this very disarming, incredibly intelligent man. But when you're hearing the story, I don't want you to make the false assumption that there's nothing going on between white folks and other people groups of color in the United States. I mean, there's stuff happening with Native Americans. There's stuff happening with Latinx people. There's stuff happening even within white ethnic communities, within American immigrants who are coming over. There's lots of layers going on. He's focusing, though, for the sake of telling this story on that specific story, because it's going to bring out some things that are really important things for the church to reconcile with.
And he brings it home, too, on page 14, where he says the failure of many Christians in the South and across the nation to decisively oppose the racism in their families, in their communities, and even in their own churches provided fertile soil for the seeds of hatred to grow.
I can imagine, because I am a white person, that a well-meaning white person might want to say, well, I don't think I'm better than people of color. And something Jemar Tisby says, and I've heard in other places, that's a little bit harder to identify, is any idea that you are normal or average. I'm just a typical American.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is a
right.
stand-in for white.
Yes.
Right.
And that is itself a part of white supremacy. A central idea to this white supremacist ideology is that white is the norm, therefore white is normal. White is the way we do things.
Right.
And that's a lot harder to say, because normal doesn't sound like better.
Right.
Until somebody's trying to do something in a way that's, quote, not normal, and then you're like, that's not the way it's done around here. So normal has a lot of power to it.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But it is a sneaky way.
It's a very social, acceptable way of voicing white supremacy.
It sounds humble. I'm just average. I'm just normal.
Yeah. And when we think of our identity and how our identity has been formed to what this normal is versus, okay, who has God created you to be? There's such a difference there. You feel that tension of, wait a minute, but this is what I'm supposed to look like in this place. And this is what I'm supposed to sound like. But then God comes in and he's like, oh, there's something different I want you to say in this space.
And I think Tisby is also trying to illuminate for us the role that the church played in perpetuating and embedding racist policies and white supremacy, and that it should share its role, its complicity in making racism what it is today. And I think very often that the church wants so much to say, no, we had nothing to do with that. But then when you look through history, that they developed the slave Bible, and the slave Bible was the way in which slaves were told what God is saying about them, between the relationship between the master and the slave. Didn't tell them about the other parts, about freedom or about liberation. But it's interesting that that black people began to identify with the Exodus event. And that somehow, in some way, even despite white supremacy, the gospel got through, and they began to look bifocally at the gospel, that those who are all talking about heaven may not all be going. And that is also, I think, what Tisby is also lifting up, is that even through the midst of that, Jesus was going to find them. And how the white constituency used the church as one of the very places and spaces to perpetuate racism.
let's talk a little bit about the 4 terms or the 4 ideas that are in this chapter. We've got racism, complicity, and then we've got confronting versus compromising. Like, what's the difference there? And then this idea at the end about courageous Christianity. So, Pastor Reggie, you were already saying just now about complicity with racism. I mean, it's in the title of the book.
Right.
Let's talk about what it means when we use those words. What does racism mean? What is complicity?
Well, racism is one definition of saying it's prejudice plus power. And that's a way of kind of encapsulizes what it does is that it touches. Prejudice isn't a bad thing when I don't have the power to make other people comply to what my idea is, as Libby said, to what normal is, and that white becomes normal, and that the white ideal becomes the way in which life is done, or which people are compared to. A lot of people would like to say that, well, I don't have any power. But when that power is manifested in saying who gets baptized, in terms of how America got started, there was a huge issue that if you start to baptize slaves, then will they be free? Then will you lose your economic prowess? And the church was tied to how they got their money? That has a lot to do with racism being embedded at the very fabric, as Jim Wallace says, this is our original sin. And so how do we begin to repent of the original sin? How do we begin to reimagine what history can tell us about what the church could be, but also own up to our complicity to say that the church played an active role in white supremacy?
So what's complicity? I mean, we're going to use that word all the time.
Yeah. So the definition is that we know that something is wrong, but we're still allowing it to happen. And so I think about how racism is in our country today. Many of us, we can see something is wrong, but then there are others that they don't see it as wrong because it's normal. Like you were saying, it is the standard, it's the lifestyle. This is what this is how it is. And so we don't really take a step back and look at things from a different perspective because, I've heard that voice over and over and over again, and this is where I'm camped out, and that, I'm not really going to entertain that thought.
Right.
Yeah, things like, I'm not being racist, I just expect you to dress professionally.
Right.
Or I just expect you to have your hair done nicely for work.
Right.
Nicely.
I expect you to speak respectfully,
right,
or professionally.
Yeah.
But all of those words, normally, professionally, respectfully, are operationally white.
Right.
I expect you to dress the way that I, as a white person, think is respectful and professional.
Right.
Yeah. That was growing up. I would get constantly, "Oh, you're from New York, but you don't sound like you're from New York." Like, yeah, I know. I went to good schools, right? And what are those good schools, right? So, yeah.
It's just very, very interesting to me if I'm thinking of people who are probably listening to this podcast and probably thinking to themselves, is there something really fearful when we hear something like complicity, when we hear stuff like racism, when we hear stuff like white supremacy, when we hear stuff about the role that the church played in perpetuating white supremacy? And I can imagine that they would probably feel fearful or bashful or, I'm not that person. I could never do something like that. And yet at the same time, when they need to be in a brave space, they don't rise to the occasion because they have to actually stand out as the only one who may confront someone who is being really racist to a child, or going through the store and notice that they are fearful when a black man passes them, or to say that when they look at the news and say, oh man, those brown people coming across the border, they must be bad people. Right. And so I can imagine someone listening to this and saying, I have nothing to do with that. But I would ask you to say, Lord, examine me. Where is my complicity when you've asked me to rise to a brave place and I chose to be fearful, to stay in the shadows, to not confront, to not stand out because I'm afraid of my own being challenged.
Yeah, and I would even challenge people to go a little deeper and say, where is my silence coming from? When I see something that's not quite right and I'm not responding to it, why? What's happening within me? Am I fearing something? And why? Where does that fear come from? And just go a little deeper.
Where do you think fear does come from?
Well, I think it comes from our core of, I don't want to be rejected. I want to be accepted. I want to belong. I want to be loved. And so there's this fear of, oh my goodness, I can lose my whole family. I can lose my spouse. I can lose my standing in my church. And so I think it goes to the core of who we are.
So, trying to figure out the right way to say this. Part of this fear of rejection mixed with power. So if we get to the base of people have different cultures, they have different ways of operating, but because white people have the most power, white culture has the most power. And a white value is tactfulness, that you do it in the right way.
Especially in this culture here.
Yes, yeah, especially Midwestern white culture.
Right.
Maybe you've seen it bubble up in other places in different capacities. But when your cultural group has the power, your culture then becomes a virtue.
Yes.
Right.
Becomes moral.
Right.
But if you look at the virtues as described in the Bible, tact is not one of them.
Right.
And so I think part of this fear is...
Let's just laugh there for a minute, because she's right. Yes.
But I think that I've had moments where somebody said something racist. I said, that was racist. And then somebody else said to me, Libby, that was rude. Or like, why didn't you talk to him independently later?
Right.
And I mean, maybe it would have been more effective to do it that way, but I was having a gut reaction to something I heard. I was not trying to be tactful, but I got punished for my tact instead of the person getting punished for being racist.
Yes, yes.
Because we have such a high moral value on tactfulness,
Right.
that it creates so much fear that I might get excluded from this in-group, from my loved ones, because I was not tactful.
Right. Yeah.
But can't
that's
that
good.
value just discourage courage?
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking of a job interview as you were talking about that. And who are your references? And tactfulness would look really good and sound really good in an interview process, right? But they don't want to hear, oh, she makes waves, and oh my goodness, she's constantly opposing and pushing back. So
That's true.
Yeah.
Right. And we saw a lot of that, in history, in which, how black people did perform church, that emotionalism was seen as weak, that to be loud and to be dancing is to be seen as, they're from a different species. They're not from the same as Adam and Eve, and how that got encapsulated, that got institutionalized. And that the proper church is that there's always a objective and tactical and 3 points sermon, that there's a liturgy in which you follow, and that law and order is the way in which God has said is supposed to be in terms of honoring the Lord, and how that was institutionalized, that those guys who started the African American Episcopal Church were not allowed to pray in the same floor that the white parishioners, and then to have them ushered out, and that the black church started because white folk didn't want us in their church.
Right.
And that tells us about how strong and powerful this complicity to racism, and then to stamp that what God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit does an amazing act on folk. It raises the social hierarchy of whites, and it places black people down at the bottom of that hierarchy, and you don't ever want to be at the bottom, because that's not the place God has meant us to be. And I think what Tisby is trying to lay out for us is, again, that complicity, that we think that these small acts of church and church life actually becomes the recipe in which the church perpetuates racism and white supremacy.
Can I ask a question about this? This is something that's been rattling around in my head this week. So I'm a worship director at a church, and I'm often looking at new music that's coming out and trying to see, like, okay, would this be good music for my multi-ethnic congregation? And it seems like maybe 10 years ago, and here's where it's difficult for me, because I don't know if this means that I'm becoming an old fart who thinks everything's crummy, or if this is something real. But when I look at, say, music coming out of the Asian church, it sounds like Hillsong. When I'm looking at new gospel that's being created, it doesn't sound anymore like Fred Hammond or Kirk Franklin. It sounds like Hillsong. And
ouch.
It used to be that there was this sense that, like, my music that I worship with says something about who I am and isn't apologizing for who I am. It's not assimilating. Are these examples of white aesthetic values for worship that are now kind of being adopted? Or is there something else going, like...
That is such a good question.
I just wonder if it's sort of like internalized white supremacy, or if there's something else going on here.
I would want to add, I don't think this is an answer, but it's just a contributing element of, if you've been listening to the 1619 Project, they had an episode about black music being American music. And I think part of it is white music has taken so much from black music. Because if you look at hymns to contemporary Christian music, we've taken a lot of traits from black music slowly and added them in. Not to say that that's different, but that's just a piece of it. We've already taken a lot of it.
But I'm noticing what I notice, and what to me feels like a loss, is that, like, so if I listen to, like, okay, I want, my kids are learning Spanish. I would love to have Spanish language praise and worship music, but a lot of it is just white praise and worship music with Spanish words. And I'm like, we kind of criticize the early missionaries for making people groups all learn hymns and stand in, choir robes and abandon their culture. And now it seems like it's kind of coming from the other direction.
Yeah, because there's no like merengue feel or salsa feel to it.
Eric, to kind of ask you a question, I think that what is happening, and there seems to be some research that seems to point to that around the 2000s, there's been a real push to make Christian music not offensive. And I mean it in the way of that it has a universal feel to it, that it has a homogenizing feel to it, and when it feels homogenized, then you can pretty much ignore race. And when you ignore race in music, you pretty much take all of the soul out of it to deal with the actual reality and inequities that is going on at the local ground level. And when that happens, you don't have music that actually challenges white stereotypes or black stereotypes, or I think the move towards that you see black songs that has that Hillsong feel to it is because there is a real push in order that it conform to white stereotype of universality and not to particularity. And when it doesn't have to conform to particularity, then everybody gets on it, can be drawn to it, can use it. But the moment that you take a song that has to deal with race, as it actually is lived in the American experience, that blows it for everybody. Because the last thing that people want to talk about is race. Some of those scholars have noticed that there's been a movement away from using multiracial to multi-ethnic. And when you use multi-ethnic just simply means everybody brings what they are to the table, and what happens is that it gets homogenized and used and commodified so that you don't have to talk about race. It's like as if race matters, but race doesn't matter. And there is a market for that kind of music.
It brings up a memory for me.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, so about 8 years ago, I was with a group in Israel, and we went to Bethlehem, and it was a Sunday morning, and we were going to be worshiping at a church there, and we knew that their language in that church was Arabic. So I was really excited, about this. So we're there, and they knew we were coming, so they had their bulletin, or their, what do you call that, the agenda, worship agenda thing, with what songs we were going to sing, when the liturgy was, and I saw that it was all songs that come out of hymnals. So they were singing in Arabic, and they encouraged us to sing in English. And so here we were, like both languages singing together. It was actually really beautiful. But I wonder, what would have an Arabic song look like and sound like there that didn't have those English roots? Where it was a new song. Right. I'm sure that there are songs like that, but it just wasn't there in the church.
Race is such a hard thing to talk about in our circles, especially in the church, because the church wants to avoid offending. The church wants to avoid talking about its real story. The church wants everybody to just get along and be like Rodney King. And so what we do is that we settle for our white fragility over against trying to confront the real issues that actually goes on in church, because you can't avoid that racism is as American as singing Amazing Grace.
Yes.
It's that American. And so we have to help people to confront that history in a way in which it brings truth, but also that it gives them grace at the same time. You got to have them both, but they live in tension with one another. They're paradoxical.
Well, we're talking about these terms, but I just want to kind of point out these topics that are in Chapter 1, this conversation right now is talking about them. I mean, this idea of courageous Christianity, doing something brave. We've been talking about that a bit. But this idea of confronting versus compromising. Can we tease that out a little bit? I kind of feel like you are already going there with this discussion about music.
Yeah.
That we were talking about, like, okay, there's this compromise about not being offensive, and that's the value around which some kinds of music is being marketed. It's market-based music. We want to make something that everybody would want to buy. Mm-hmm. And we could pawn it off as like that this is like being a peacemaker, or it could be saccharine.
Yeah, so and I'm not sure why. I'm going to have to figure out what the root of this is, but every time I hear the word compromise, I get this yucky feeling inside of me, because it feels like, oh, you want me to give up something? I don't want to give up anything. I want you to hear me.
So what is the difference for each of you when you're thinking about this idea of confronting versus compromising?
I look at confronting as a way of helping to discover what I didn't know. And coming from a person who's not speaking from the outside, but rather on the inside. You know, not too long ago, I wrote something about what I discovered about baptism in my denomination, and that baptism was not allowed, that the church did not have to baptize adopted children. And because
Really?
it didn't, because they didn't have to adopt adopted children, because they didn't know the origin of what the parents were in terms of their own Christian walk. And because of that uncertainty, there was a long-held policy that churches could refuse to not baptize children who were not naturally born. And that was like, whoa, I didn't know that. And then to talk about that before people, some who would say, well, that makes great sense if it was in the 1908, 1920, 1930s. But it also revealed how insular, how suspicious that they were of being infiltrated or polluted by children who were not naturally born. And that's a church, that's the means of grace of how a person gets into the family of God. And we made those same kind of, you can make those same kind of analogies when you talk about race. That there were prohibitions that for those who could preach the word. There were prohibitions when a black minister would preach on the plantation, but he had to be watched by a white overseer or by the owner of the plantation, and how those kind of things were never confronted by all those who knew they had a stake in it. And yet at the same time, there were some who confront that. I'm thinking about the abolitionists who said, no, this is wrong. This cannot happen. This cannot continue. But that meant being outside of the norm, being outside of the white norm of why can't you just follow what we all are doing and just play along? And rather, most of them were compromising because they had too much to lose by losing either economically, politically, socially, and culturally.
For me, it's interesting to see where theology is used to justify compromising. So you just talked about baptism, so you might say, well, what if this baby has already been baptized? We don't want to re-baptize this baby because that does not agree with our theology, which, number one, baptism belongs to God, you can't break it. But there's all of these other things, like the idea of having things right and in order. We have to do it in the right way. That matters. We can't just have anybody preach who hasn't been licensed, because that would not be right and in order. We can't have people take the sacraments if they haven't given a profession of faith, because that wouldn't be right and in order. Except, when you look at 1 Corinthians, the context of the idea of right and in order is justice at the table. It's the rich people were eating all of the communion before the poor people got out of work. And they were being confronted that their worship was not right and in order. And so we've taken this theological concept, this cultural concept of right and in order, and saying, no, God wants us to do it the right way. That's why we have to exclude certain people, when the whole point of the phrase was inclusion.
Right.
Was justice.
Yeah, and how we can easily mask that about our own, the story that we want to tell, the story we want to perpetuate, the rituals we want to continue, to say that we have control over this, not the church, not Jesus, not all these other people, not even church history, but we want to adopt this to our own particular cultural understanding, and we want everybody else to follow it because we believe that this is the right way. And if it was right for us, then it's right for everybody else. So it just amazes me that this becomes the standard for every person of color who comes into a white denomination, and you dare not trespass over these traditions because we know that they're right, and we know that they're white.
I mean, I told this story before, but I'll tell it again. I had someone this past week confront me, and they were wise. I feel lucky. I feel like God's putting people in my life who, for me as a leader, are showing me how to be a better leader. And that's kind of lucky. But I said something in church where I was speaking spontaneously. I felt that if God was looking at our congregation, that he would be upset. I don't know if that's exactly true. I certainly was starting to feel upset, but I was feeling offended for God. So I spoke spontaneously about it because I was hoping to encourage people to worship more deeply. But I think a part of me was mixed in there too. And this guy took me out for coffee and in the most loving way brought this up and talked to me about how I could probably be more effective if I was invitational. And he remembered sometimes that I had been invitational and brought that out to me and pointed out to me that like I had the capacity to be invitational, but he felt like I was starting to kind of cross a line. And I felt really loved because he cared about me enough to tell me the truth. He's probably the kind of friend that would tell me if I had toilet paper on my shoe. Or that, you know, my underwear was sticking up from my pants when I'm getting off an airplane. You know, so, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where, like, he wasn't as afraid about how he was going to feel about bringing up to me this uncomfortable thing as much as helping me grow. I want to be like him. I'm kind of hoping actually this podcast is a little bit like him, that we can confront courageously some of the stuff that's like, these are the skeletons in the closet of the American church.
Right.
I don't know. I'm hoping we do it well. I'm hoping we kind of invite people to be curious about what's in here and to realize it's not going to kill us. It'll actually explain the story better so that we realize, like, oh, so that's why things are the way they are. See how it's not anywhere close to the worship that's going to be happening, you know, it's referenced in Revelations and stuff like that, and be like, okay, let's figure out how we can develop some next steps to get there.
Yeah, I liked his quote on page 19 where he talks about, yes, racism, grew and was perpetuated through the Christian church, but he says Christianity has an inspiring history of working for racial equity and dignity. So there were people in the church that saw, all right, yeah, you might think this is normal, but this doesn't seem right in my spirit. This doesn't seem right for this person and what is happening to them. And I am going to step up and I am going to say something. So the Christian church has been a place too of people rising up and bringing their voices together.
We're the collection of saints and sinners, and I think that's important to realize that we're both.
Right.
We're not the people that we wish we were. And God redeems us from the worst that we can become, and he gives us grace. And it's like, I don't know, it's that thing that drives me nuts, because that means that I have to give grace to people that I don't like at all.
Right.
Which totally sucks. And I'm really glad that I get that.
Yeah.
Because I'm that person for somebody else.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on page 22, the author says that our goal should never be guilt. So I can understand where that gentleman at your church, he probably sensed, you know what, I'm feeling, or maybe like this I'm sensing some discomfort here, which discomfort isn't bad, but he probably sensed something different from you at a different time, a loving, like, okay, I want to enter into this space with you together, and I want to share my grieving heart. Yeah.
Libby gives this wonderful analogy of inoculation. And I can imagine that this man who lovingly confronted you gave you a small inoculation to help you to be braver in terms of being more invitational than confrontational. And so I think that what's happening in this book is to give you inoculations of American history to help you become brave and resilient, even in the midst of hearing hard truth, and that you become more courageous than the day before. And so you're going to be interacting with a lot of people who were able to be courageous during times in American church history, whether that was those who stood up against slavery and fought it mindfully, some who did it with not the greatest circumstances or motives, or give you this sweep through Lincoln, who didn't really want to do anything about slavery, but rather just to save the Union. And so you're getting this mix of darkness and lightness. And our hope is that you become a more nuanced kind of Christian about the history of the church in America and how you can move towards stripping down, inoculating, or even tearing down some of the false narratives and myths that has stopped you from being courageous. And hopefully that you will begin to be brave than what you were after these podcasts.
Can we talk a little bit about history versus narrative a minute before we close out?
Sure.
Like, what's the difference between those? Wait, no, what's the same? What's different?
We all got narratives. Our narratives are the stories in which I like what the historian David Blight says. He says that narratives are the stories we tell ourselves. History is the stuff that's actually about us, both good and bad. And I like that. I like that saying, is that white supremacists have a story that they tell themselves. People on the East Coast has a story that they tell themselves. People in West Michigan has a story that they tell themselves. Now, that story doesn't necessarily match up with history, because history is the factual way in which we actually come to an empire who says, this is what actually happened. And sometimes we have to have that truth that history tells us. The Bible is full of history that tells us what we actually are, what we actually done, and what Jesus has done, even when we didn't want to, when we wanted a king instead of a savior. We wanted a cheerleader instead of a Lord. And a lot of our American values get tied up as part of the story that we tell ourselves, rather than the story that actually tells us who we actually are. And that's what Scripture does. And hopefully that we will have this nice conversation, nice loving confrontation with not only Scripture, but with our own history, so that we can have a better picture of the story that we need to tell for the betterment and benefit of dispensing power as the only way to get an identity.
Have you ever had somebody say to you, maybe in person, or like they left you a voicemail or a text that was like, I need to talk to you about something? And then suddenly your head is spinning. Like you just invented the worst.
I don't want to know. I don't want to know.
What did I do?
I would say that's maybe a bad way to start a confrontation, and it leads to stories and not histories. These stories have to be negative instead of positive. And I think by sharing these histories, we're also hoping that we can engage in the sort of confrontation that is not ill-informed or reactive, but rather to say, I experienced this from you. That might not have been how you experienced it, but can we talk about that incident? And then you're not coming to this table thinking, oh, this person's going to call me a racist, this person's going to kick me out, but rather like, no, this person has an incident that they want to talk to me about. And I might still feel defensive.
Sure.
But it's an entirely different situation than all of the things I could make up.
My pastor, we work closely. We have to make contact many times a week. We started borrowing this idea from Brene Brown about the story I'm telling myself is. So, I saw you send this text, and then the story I'm telling myself is that you're pissed off at me and didn't want to do this in a phone call. Is that really what's going on? And I'm like, let's talk. And then we'll talk it out. But like that's the story I'm telling myself has been a good way for us at least to kind of have a more open working relationship that shares where we're missing each other in a way that kind of like we don't take it personally because the person's owning their inner dialogue.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like they're blaming me. They're like, can you tell me a better story to make sense out of this? Occasionally there is no better story because they're right on the money. But a lot of times there is.
Yeah. I'm co-teaching a class on Wednesday nights from Pete Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy Relationships. And
those are great. That is a great series.
It is really good. And so the person I'm co-leading with, we're hoping that through these sessions we can build a groundwork to be able to move into conversations about race in a healthier way. That's our hope, so you can be praying.
You are really just going to shoot for it, aren't you, Susie?
Well, and so anyway, they suggest that when you want to confront someone and you have like all these emotions and all these different thoughts, try approaching the person with this phrase, I am puzzled about this. And so you come in curious and you want to understand that person. And so I think that is a missing link in many conversations. We just want to say what we have to say. We don't really want to hear the other person and invite them into a dialogue where it's going back and forth.
Yeah, you're talking to me right now.
Yeah.
Feeling a little convicted.
Yeah. That was my ad lib in there because of my own story and my own way of being.
I am right with you. Like I can think of all this stuff I want to say and I write it down, sometimes thinking I was going to get it out of my head, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it's just stoking the fire.
Right.
And yep. So that's why I'm on a podcast. No. Maybe there's a little truth in there. I don't know. I am really honestly trying to grow in this stuff.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling this book and everything, like, I'm certain I will grow. I'm certain I'm going to feel convicted, and I'm pretty certain that I'll say something totally stupid on a recording at some point.
The nice thing is you get to edit.
Yeah, okay. but I'm actually hoping that you guys will check me.
Yeah.
And either, while we're recording or in the Midwestern way of confronting me in private afterwards. But I actually wouldn't mind if you did it while we're recording. Even though I'm going to have massive angst about whether I should leave that in, because the answer probably is going to be that I need to leave it in.
I think we're all going to have moments like that. Yeah. So you're not alone.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have moments where something's going to hit us emotionally, and we're not going to know what to do with that.
Right.
And during those times, maybe that's when, we offer it up in prayer.
Yeah.
We offer it as a sacrifice before the Lord and say, Lord, I don't understand this, and you probably know what's touched me, and I want to offer that to you as my own worship of myself, and ask for forgiveness and correction, and as one help me to do better.
And I think we can make a pact and an agreement where this could be a safe space for us, where it's not coming from a place of attacking, but we really want to know, and it's through love that we're saying that we're gonna grow together. And I think if we enter this space knowing, I don't know everything, I'm here to learn, I'm here to engage, I think I think that would be a great model then for other people to engage conversations in that way too.
Yeah. Yep.
I keep thinking of Philippians 2, specifically, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. But the good news is what comes next is, for it is God who is at work in you.
Amen. Oof, I got
you
chills.
both to will and to work for God's good pleasure.
That's good.
Amen. Amen. That's the last word right there. Drop the mic there. Drop it.
Don't drop it. It's actually kind of...
Oh, come on.
These would be really expensive to read. It only takes one drop. You've been listening to the Antioch Podcast. Worship well together.
This concludes our broadcast day.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Goodbye.
And God bless.
Thank you so much.
Antioch Podcast listeners, we'd love to stay in touch. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter, as well as on the web at www.antiochpodcast.org. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, and while you're there, please rate and review us. Positive reviews help others find us when looking for quality podcasts. And now, for our regular post-podcast disclaimer.
You have been listening to the Antioch Podcast. The opinions expressed on the Antioch Podcast are not the official views of Madison Church, its leadership, or the denomination of the Christian Reformed Church. Madison Church is a member of the Christian Reformed Church and adheres to its doctrinal standards. The purpose of this podcast is to provide recorded examples of the kinds of conversations which we believe churches need to have in an increasingly diverse world. These kinds of conversations pave the way for a multi-ethnic congregation to design worship services with unity and justice, and truly worship God diversely together. Thanks for listening.